Nobody in her family wanted the land. 11 acres in the Ozark Mountains, no utilities, no structures, no value anyone could see. She saw something different. She moved onto it, built a cabin from timber the storm had already felled, and spent the better part of 5 months learning what her grandmother had already figured out 30 years before she was born. Maya Calloway was 21 years old and sitting in the parking lot of a Springfield, Missouri Walmart at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, eating a gas station sandwich she had bought 3 hours earlier and could not finish because her stomach had been doing that thing it did when she was scared, the specific scared of watching numbers that will never add up no matter how many times you run them. She had run them 6 times that day. The sandwich wrapper had the numbers written on it in her own handwriting. Rent, $650. Utilities, $140. Phone, $45. Food, $200. Gas, $120. Total, $155. Monthly take home, after taxes. Working 32 hours a week at a Springfield restaurant that had just posted a handwritten sign on the door that said, "Closed permanently. Thank you for your support." $890. The difference between those two numbers was not a gap. It was a wall. She had no subscriptions, no credit card debt, no habits that cost anything. She had a backpack with 4 days of clothes, a toiletry bag, a phone at 34% battery, and $1,847 in a checking account that represented 3 years of careful living. She had been careful her whole life. Careful had brought her to a Walmart parking lot at midnight doing arithmetic on a sandwich wrapper. She was not crying. She had already done that earlier, in the parking lot of the restaurant where she had found the sign, standing alone on the sidewalk for 11 minutes before getting in her car. She allowed herself 11 minutes. Then she stopped. What she needed was not sympathy. What she needed was a number that worked. She did not have one yet, but 3 days later, a letter forwarded from her mother's address in Kansas City would give her something she had not known she possessed. Something that had been sitting in Stone County, Missouri for 3 years, waiting for someone to need it badly enough to go looking. The letter was from a probate attorney named Gerald Huff, whose office was in Galena, Missouri, and whose stationery had a small illustration of the James River in the upper left corner. It was the third letter he had sent, each one to a different address he had located through the family. Her mother's house first, then a forwarding address that had expired, then her mother's house again, with a note asking that it be passed along. Maya had not opened the first two because they looked like junk mail, and she had been moving between sublets and did not always receive everything forwarded to her. The letter said that her grandmother, Ruth Ann Calloway, had died in March of 2021 and had left behind a parcel of land in Stone County, 11 acres on a gravel road outside the town of Crane, no utilities, no structures, no road frontage on the county highway. The assessed value was $4,200. Nobody in the family had contested the estate because nobody had wanted it. Her mother had not mentioned it. Maya called her mother that evening. Her mother said, "Oh, that old place. I didn't think you'd want it. Honey, there's nothing out there." On the Monday after, she called Gerald Huff. He told her the estate had been sitting open for 3 years because no one had responded to his letters, and that closing it was straightforward. No contested claims, no liens, no other heirs who had filed. She would need to sign a disclaimer from each family member who had been notified, pay the court filing fee of $220, and wait approximately 8 weeks for the deed to transfer. She asked if she could work the land in the meantime. He paused and said, legally, he would advise waiting for the deed. She thanked him and drove to Stone County the following Saturday. 2 hours south on 65, then a county road, then a gravel road that her phone's GPS gave up on after half a mile and displayed a spinning wheel like it was embarrassed. She parked where the road dead-ended at a rusted gate and walked in. The land was steep on the north end and opened into a shallow hollow on the south, where a seasonal creek ran clear over flat limestone. The trees were enormous: white oak, shagbark hickory, eastern red cedar. She stood in the middle of the hollow and turned slowly, the way you turn when you're trying to understand the shape of something too large to see all at once. She did not feel peace. She felt the specific vertigo of a person who has just been handed a problem that might also be an answer and cannot yet tell which one it is. She stood there for 40 minutes. Then she drove back to Springfield and ran the numbers again. This time, the number at the bottom was different. She came back to the land on a Wednesday in early April with a pair of work gloves with rubber boots she had bought used for $7 at a Goodwill in Ozark and a notepad. What she found when she walked the property slowly, systematically, corner to corner the way her father had taught her to walk a used car lot before you ever talk to anyone. Look first, talk later. Was this. The ice storm that had moved through Stone County in January of 2023 had knocked down somewhere between 35 and 40 trees. She counted 37 she could positively identify as downed and not yet decayed. White oak, mostly, with several hickory, and 4 large cedars lying across each other in the northwest corner, like a game of pickup sticks played by something enormous and indifferent. She picked up a piece of oak, pressed her thumbnail into the end grain, and felt resistance. She pulled the bark back near the middle of the trunk. The wood underneath was pale gold, dense, and smelled faintly of something between rain and sawdust. It was not even close to rotten. It was, she would learn later, from a man named Earl Whitfield, who lived a mile down the gravel road and had spent 31 years working for the Missouri Department of Conservation, exactly what she hoped it was. Earl was 67 years old, soft-spoken, and wore the same canvas jacket every time she saw him regardless of temperature. She knocked on his door that afternoon because his was the only mailbox on the road. She told him what she had found. He put on his boots and came with her. He walked the downed trees for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "You've got about 14 months on most of this oak before the heart starts to go. After that, you're burning it, not building with it." He paused. "What are you building?" She said she didn't know yet. He nodded like that was the most honest answer she could have given. She had asked Earl if she could borrow his chainsaw. He said no, not rudely. He said it the way a person says no when they've seen what happens when the answer is yes too quickly. He said, "You don't know what you've got yet. You cut before you know, you'll ruin half of it." So instead of a chainsaw, she got 2 afternoons of Earl Whitfield, standing beside downed trees, telling her things that no class teaches, because no class knows how the particular grain of a white oak that fell in an ice storm in Stone County, Missouri, behaves under a blade. He showed her how to knock on the wood with his knuckle. Flat sound meant solid core. Hollow ring meant decay had started. He showed her how to look at the end grain of a cut stump. Rings tight together meant slow growth, meant dense. Wood meant structural quality. Rings far apart meant fast growth, meant soft wood, meant it would dent under weight. He showed her how cedar smelled different when it was healthy versus when moisture had gotten into the heartwood and begun the slow work of turning it back into soil. She took notes. 3 pages of notes in her yellow notepad, written in the compressed handwriting she used when she was trying not to forget something. She had bought a ripsaw at a hardware store in Galena, used a 30-inch blade, still sharp enough, $18. She had paid the probate filing fee by money order from the post office in Galena, $220, the only large number she had spent that felt like moving towards something rather than away from it. She had 1,614ers left. She did not feel ready, but Earl had told her the day before. The wood doesn't wait for ready. It just waits for you to start. She started on a Thursday morning in late April. She was 21 years old, and she was about to learn what her hands could do. She spent a week walking the hollow before she chose where to build. She was not walking slowly because she was unsure. She was walking slowly because she had made the mistake once of deciding too fast. The first spot she had liked was a flat shelf of ground 15 feet from the creek's edge, shaded, quiet, soft underfoot. She had almost staked it out when Earl came by on a Saturday afternoon and pointed to a ring of discoloration on the bark of a sycamore tree 8 feet from her proposed corner. The ring was 40 inches off the ground. That was the high water mark from April of the previous year. Not a flood, just spring runoff, standing water for 3 days after heavy rain. 3 days of standing water against a foundation every spring for 20 years. She had thanked him and kept walking. She found the site 4 days later, a level bench of ground on the south-facing slope of the hollow, elevated above the creek by 22 feet, anchored by limestone bedrock that she found 18 inches below the surface when she drove a metal rod into the earth with a hand sledge. Bedrock was the answer to a problem she had not known how to solve. She had fetting $400 left and could not afford the concrete needed for poured footings. Earl showed her what to do instead. The limestone in that hollow had been splitting along natural plains for 10,000 years. There were flat-faced stones everywhere, some the size of a laptop, some the size of a dining table. They stacked. Earl showed her how the Ozark settlers had set foundations without mortar for 200 years. Widest stone at the bottom, each layer smaller, no two joints aligned vertically, so the weight distributed itself outward and downward into the earth rather than straight down a crack. She set 4 piers in 2 days. Her shoulders ached in a way that felt different from tired. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. Every board that would frame her walls came from the 37 trees the ice storm had already laid down. The problem was not the cutting. The problem was time. Earl had explained it plainly. Green oak, freshly cut, still holding its moisture, would shrink as it dried. A board 8 inches wide cut from a fresh-felled oak would lose nearly half an inch of width over 60 to 90 days as it air-dried. Frame a wall with green lumber. Close it in before it dries, and the shrinkage happens inside the wall, warping studs until your plumb lines become suggestions rather than facts. She had learned this on a Thursday. On Friday, she had already cut 20 boards. She had been ready to start framing on Saturday morning. Instead, she spent Saturday building a drying rack from scrap limbs lashed with paracord. Stickers every 24 inches between each layer of boards to let the Ozark air move through. She stacked everything she had cut. Then she covered the top with a sheet of black plastic salvaged from an old livestock pond liner she found, rolled up in the brush at the edge of the property, and she went back to Springfield to pick up more shifts at a diner on Glenstone Avenue that had hired her 3 weeks before to work breakfast and lunch. The waiting felt like punishment at first. She would drive out to the land on her days off and stand beside the drying rack and press her thumbnail into the edge of a board and feel the slight give of wood still releasing its moisture into the air. By the 5th week, it felt less like waiting and more like the wood doing something she couldn't do for it. By the 6th week, the boards had found their dimensions. She could frame. She framed the floor deck first. Sill beams of white oak set directly on the stone piers, joists at 16 inches on center, a subfloor of the flattest boards she had. She checked level with a length of clear vinyl tubing filled with water. Both ends held up, water surface equal on both sides meant level. The same tool Earl's father had used and his father before him, accurate to within 1/8 of an inch across a 30-foot span. Then she framed the first wall flat on the subfloor, working from what Earl had shown her and what she had pieced together from 2 library books she had checked out in Springfield before driving south. Studs, top plate, bottom plate, rough openings for the door and the single south-facing window. She nailed everything twice. Then she tied a length of rope to the top plate, ran the rope up and over a branch of the white oak tree standing 12 feet north of the cabin site, and pulled. The wall came up slowly, scraped across the subfloor, tipped past 45 degrees, and stood vertical. She drove a diagonal brace from the top corner to the subfloor to hold it while she caught her breath. Then she did it 3 more times. On the 4th wall, she discovered the problem. The northeast corner pier had shifted slightly under the weight of the joists, less than 3/4 of an inch, but it was enough. The cabin was a parallelogram. She stood inside the frame, looking at lines that should have been parallel running toward each other at an angle so slight it was almost insulting. She took the northeast wall down. She shimmed the pier with a split of limestone until the level tube read flat. She reframed. It took a full day. It was the most important day of the build. She was on top of the wall plates, trying to figure out the ridgeboard problem. How to hold the first rafter in place with no one to hold the other end, when she heard gravel popping under tires on the road below. A silver Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight stopped. A woman got out. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, wearing a gray Carhartt jacket and boots with dried concrete on the left toe. She looked at the cabin frame for a moment, then looked up at Maya, standing on a 4-inch wide top plate 8 feet off the ground, holding a rafter that wanted to go somewhere other than where she was pointing. The woman said, "You doing rafters alone?" Maya said no. She thought about saying she'd had help, a neighbor named Earl, 2 afternoons, things she could not have known otherwise. But she did not say it. The woman said, I've set 3 roofs. You want a hand or you want a story about how you did it yourself? Her name was Sandra Briggs. She was an electrician from Crane who had built 2 small structures on her own property over the past decade. She still had a dog-eared construction manual in her truck. She stayed 4 hours. Between the 2 of them, they set all 7 rafters, cut the birds' mouths, nailed the ridge board, and had the roof skeleton standing before the light went flat. Sandra showed Maya how to cut the compound angle at the ridge without a miter saw. Pencil line, handsaw, 1 clean pass. When she left, she said, Your plumb lines are good. Your father teach you? Maya said no. Sandra nodded. Then you taught yourself. That's harder. She drove away before Maya could ask for her number, but she had written her name and her trade on the back of a business card from a plumbing supply company and left it on the subfloor under a nail so it wouldn't blow away. The cedar shingles came next. The 4 down cedars in the northwest corner had been waiting. Maya split them with a froe she bought at an antique store in Galena for $12. Working the blade along the grain the way Earl had shown her, each shingle tapering from thick to thin, 314 pieces over 11 days. She lapped them from eave to ridge, 1/3 exposure, pressed tight. When the first rain came, she sat inside and listened, and there was no sound she needed to hear. She moved in on the 14th of September. The first night, she lit a small fire in a metal bucket inside the cabin to test the draw of the stovepipe before the wood stove she had bought off. Facebook Marketplace arrived. A small cast iron unit for $90, barely used, sold by a family in Aurora who had put in propane. The fire in the bucket was small. The cabin was tight. She had chinked every gap with a mixture of clay from the creek bank and dried moss, the same method she had copied out of one of the library books into her yellow notepad back in Springfield. And it had worked better than she expected. 20 minutes after she lit the fire, she had a headache behind her left eye. 17 minutes after that, she had her hand on the door latch. She stepped outside and stood in the cold September air for 5 minutes, breathing carefully, understanding exactly what had almost happened and why. The cabin needed to breathe. She spent the next 2 days cutting 2 ventilation slots 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall into opposite walls just below the roofline, north and south, and fitting them with hinged wooden covers she could open or close with a cord from inside. The passive solar she had not fully planned for. The cabin faced south because the only level bench of ground sat on the south-facing slope, and she had chosen that slope for its stone and its grade, not because she had calculated sun angles. The benefit turned out to be larger than she had understood when she made the choice. But in December, when the sun's angle dropped to 30 degrees above the horizon, it entered the 2 south-facing windows from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and heated the stone floor she had laid inside the cabin. Flat limestone pieces bedded in sand, until the stones were warm to the touch by early afternoon. On clear December days, she did not light the stove until after 4 p.m. In January, she understood what her grandmother had understood. Stone remembers heat. Wood remembers its shape. Water remembers where it's been. None of these things need to be taught. They just need to be used. Earl had mentioned it in passing one afternoon in October, that the old Calloway woman had stored some things in the barn of the Hensley place next parcel over, years before the Hensleys moved away, and nobody had ever come to collect them. He said it the way he said most things, as fact, without weight attached. She had walked over the following morning and found the barn unlocked, the door hanging open on a broken hinge. In the wooden crate she had carried out of the barn on the neighboring property. The one with the 2 glass oil lamps and the box of cotton wicks, the paper sleeve gone soft and brown at the edges, but the wicks themselves still dry at the center. There was a notebook. She had set it aside for weeks because she was busy, and because she was not sure she wanted to read it. It was small, cloth-covered and faded brown, the kind sold at dime stores in the 1980s, and it had her grandmother's name written inside the front cover in blue ballpoint. Ruth Ann Calloway, Stone County, Missouri, 1987. She read it for the first time on a January night by lamp oil light, the stove ticking beside her, the hollow silent outside. Ruth Calloway had taught herself to build. Not because she wanted to, because in 1987 Her husband had died of a heart attack at 53, and she was alone on 11 acres with no neighbors close, and a barn roof that was going and no money to hire anyone and no one who had offered. She had figured it out. 60 pages of cramped, precise handwriting, how to read a level, how to cut a mortise, how to set a window plumb when the rough opening isn't quite right. The same problems, the same solutions, the same land. Maya sat with the notebook until the lamp needed refilling and then filled it and kept reading. She had never met Ruth Calloway. Her mother had kept the distance between them for reasons Maya did not fully understand and had stopped asking about. But sitting in the cabin she had built on the land Ruth had kept, reading instructions Ruth had written for no one specific and somehow entirely for her, she felt the specific weight of being known by someone who never knew you were coming. By spring, she had saved $200. She used $800 of it to begin a second cabin, 30 feet east of the first, on another level shelf of ground she had identified in October. The second cabin went up faster. She knew what the wood would do. She knew how the stone sat. She knew which problems would come and approximately when. The first cabin she rented for $65 a night to people who drove down from Kansas City and Springfield looking for somewhere quiet and off-grid and real. The second cabin she was still finishing. On the dashboard of her car, held in place by a piece of tape that was doing its best, was a photograph of a woman she had never met standing in front of a barn on a hill. Ruth was not smiling in the photograph, but she was standing straight. The way a person stands when they have just finished something hard and are not done yet. She had been standing that way for months. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and drop a comment telling me which stage hit hardest and where in the world you are reading this from.